Good evening from our headquarters in Kiev. This is the Sunday show on Hromadske International, the only prime-time TV program explaining the Eastern European geopolitical storm in English. And I'm a reporter, Natalia Gumenyuk, today working for you from this studio. So today in the show, we have a large number of topics. We'll talk about Ukrainian newest education law. As well, we would talk about the German elections and its impact to the Ukraine and Russia. We have an interview with Michael McFaul, former US ambassador to Russia. As well, we follow Zapad military exercises as well. There are also the historical film which enrages Orthodox Christian believers in Russia. So this is the full, there are way more topics to discuss, but I'll be back in a second. Ukraine has passed a new education law, and we have with us Igor Samokhin, who is the education policy expert from CEDOS think tank, and he's with us to explain both what changes and concerns offer the effect of this reform on the minority. So, Igor, just before we start, I have to explain that by many accounts, the reform has much to offer: higher salaries for teachers, more local control of schools and curriculum improvements. It was also developed with the active participation of civil society and incorporates input from the public. But one aspect of the law is causing controversy: language. The bill would require all students to study in the Ukrainian language after the 4th grade and would eliminate minority language schools. That's how it's said. This has sparked conflict with some of the neighboring countries who are concerned for their co-ethnics in Ukraine. It also has provoked debates with Ukraine among teachers, parents, and even students. That is all in our program. But first of all, explain us what is this law about?
Yeah, thank you. Good evening. The law on education is the main law on education in Ukraine, which covers all levels of education, starting from primary and to higher education. It is not the only law that regulates education in Ukraine, but it is
What's new there? What's new?
Yeah, the new things are more control to the localities, more autonomy for schools, more autonomy for teachers, more possibilities for teachers to improve their curricula, to improve their own education, less control over schools from local government, and more governing bodies which consist of parents and other persons in localities who are stakeholders in these schools.
What was the role of the civil society in creating it?
Yes,
I think that would probably the reason why there was there was this kind of huge support of this law by Ukrainians, despite the language issue.
Yes, there was a big support in media, in social media, and it was seen as a landmark reform for education in Ukraine, because many NGOs, including our NGO, CEDOS think tank, took part in advising government on writing this law, in promoting specific articles of this law, on promoting specific progressive reforms that are contained in this law. So this law, more than many others, is based on civil society.
Yes, so with that, we also spoke to Oksana Makarenko, an advisor to the Minister of Education and Science, and she explained what the goals of the education reform, how they are addressed, and also answered on the concern regarding the language, which would be the part of this discussion later.
Ukraine is not the only country currently undergoing the crisis of educational systems. The whole world is now looking for ways to reform and renovate education, since we have new technologies, new values, new requirements by employers in the market. The old Ukrainian education system does not help children become successful in today's world. Besides this, our education system, especially in the middle classes, has not had any reforms for over a century. The same teaching methods have been used for decades. The teacher's role has changed today. It is no longer just to transfer knowledge from books to kids, but to form the core knowledge so that the child will be able to use it in different life situations in the future. And this law includes mechanisms that makes this possible. Qualification agencies, and their role is to gather job requirements from the market and convert them into educational standards. Children can become innovators only if the surroundings allow them to make mistakes. Surroundings where kids can experiment, do research, make hypotheses, and then prove or disprove them, and where they have tools for that, including a developed intuition. It's important for us to start treating teachers differently and to change their motivation to allow their creativity to flow. And this system allows that, up to the point that teachers are allowed to pick which books they want to use in teaching and how long to dedicate to each subject. We are not deluded with regards to the time period this reform will take. That's why we've stretched it over 10 years. It will be put into action from 2018 onwards, so the first primary school kids to experience it will probably be those graduating in the year 2029-2030.
One of the most discussed aspects of the reform is that it implies that the languages of minorities can now only be used to teach kids in grades 1 through 4. What grounds did you have for this particular decision, and what will happen to the minority languages after 4th grade?
This is, of course, a political question that got a little painful. We have an objective situation with Ukrainian, our national language, needing protection. For example, 70% of kids who graduated from minority language schools in Beregovo in Zakarpattia get around 1 to 3 out of 12 points in their Ukrainian language admission exam. This shows that Ukrainian citizens graduating from minority language schools virtually don't know the national language. In result, they have limited choice of universities to go to, because most universities teach in Ukrainian, and they cannot work at most state positions in the future. This law stays within the framework of the Constitution of Ukraine that guarantees ethnic minorities the right to study their native language. It also doesn't violate the document on regional languages that was implemented by the European Union and ratified by Ukraine. But at the same time, it helps Ukrainian language spread in schools.
Is the Ministry of Education prepared for the protests of Russian and Hungarian speakers in the south and east of Ukraine and the Zakarpattia region? Because as far as I remember, the statistics say that around 200,000 students study in Russian, so this can anger parents. Is there a mechanism for dealing with this?
I know that there are parents who don't know Ukrainian themselves, and they are worried that they won't be able to help their children with homework, and that's why they chose Russian language schools for their kids. And there are those who, on the contrary, demand for more Ukrainian language to be taught in school, despite the fact that they can't speak it themselves, and they just want their children to know the national language. There are many such parents in the south and east of Ukraine. Yes, it's been perceived as a painful, problematic question, but I think that people have accepted it, and now they try to see what they need to do next rather than just protest.
So as far we can explain that it was highly supported by the civil society due some kind of the positive changes, and probably that was maybe the part why there was not much criticism inside of Ukraine for this law. So can you elaborate a bit on more, and how comes then this language issue had appeared?
Yes, the law overall is has a huge support in Ukraine. Of course, there is also a controversial issue of 12-year school, which is not supported by many parents in Ukraine because they believe that the children do not have to spend that many years in school, but it is by experts and by European governments, it is generally considered that 12 years is a better time frame to cover all that is needed to be covered in school, and that children can be more adult and more grown up when they finish the school. So it is partly controversial in Ukraine. But overall, the thing that I thought about, more autonomy, more local control, more parents' control, and so on, these things, and also higher salaries for teachers, which are to be minimum 3 minimum Ukrainian salaries. So it's like even the teacher who just begins to teach, he will have 3 times more bigger salary than the unskilled worker.
And the teachers were always underpaid in Ukraine, so of course there is the support of that particular policy, but my colleagues from Hromadske also went to the schools, and especially to the Russian language schools. That is where there is a lot of interest, and talked to the students and parents. Some of them believe the reform will cause the problems, but others believe the change is doable and even important.
Starting next year, Ukraine will implement a new education reform that will change how teachers teach and students study. Many aspects of the reform are fairly uncontroversial, but one is provoking controversy on an international level. According to the reform, minority languages can only be used to teach until the 4th grade. In practice, this means there will no longer be separate schools where the primary language of instruction is anything other than Ukrainian. Instead, minority language schools must transition to a new program. Tatiana Fedunova, director of Kiev Russian Language School number 85, says that such a transition will prove difficult for her students.
This school has been teaching in Russian throughout the entire history. Russian language has been used since the school was founded in 1956. Our students are of more than 30 nationalities and backgrounds, foreigners, children of diplomats whose professional interests lie in Kiev, and we also all communicate in Russian here.
Supporters of the reform say that it will help students prepare for the Ukrainian language component of the compulsory university entrance exam. In their opinion, this exam is always a challenge for students who studied in languages other than Ukrainian. But Fedunova doesn't agree and says this has never been an issue before.
I'm very proud of how well our children performed on their entrance examinations. First of all, they all choose to do their exams in the Ukrainian language as opposed to Russian. And for a school with Russian as a medium of instruction, that's a great result. Absolutely all of them passed their exams in Ukrainian with flying colors.
But Anna Boyko, the director of another Russian language school, says that teachers will be happy to switch to Ukrainian.
I will not have any problems with starting to teach in Ukrainian. This is not our biggest worry at the moment. Ukrainian language has been taught here, the children all know it, we follow Ukrainian traditions, holidays and events are all held in Ukrainian.
It seems like the biggest naysayers of this new education reform are parents. They say they want their children to graduate from a Russian language school and say they have legitimate reasons.
Ukraine is particularly located in the center of Europe, connecting Europe's east and west. We carry both Eastern and Western cultures, and it's great when we can speak the language of our neighbor. I think knowing Russian for the sake of just speaking is not enough. Children need to know the grammar and be able to write well. A Russian school gives children an equal amount of language skills in Ukrainian and Russian. In my opinion, if we consider the country an aggressor, then completely different measures should be applied. It's unreasonable to apply the same rule to the language. If there is a war with the US tomorrow, would that mean that we need to stop learning English?
Many people I've talked with say they want to move to a different country with their children, and trust me, these people are not stupid, they have university degrees. This reform will prove to be a bad decision for Ukraine. Despite the parents' criticism, the children themselves seem ready to switch to Ukrainian. They acknowledge there are difficulties, but they also believe that this is a necessary step.
Our language of instruction was Russian, so it will be hard for us to switch to Ukrainian, especially because some scientific subjects have very specific terms. But we need to do this because we live and study in Ukraine, and we will work here in the future too.
So here, can you explain, so if that law had been widely discussed among the civil society, in particular everything connected to education, not the language, there was not much discussion about the language, or were any different communities consulted? What should people know about that?
Yeah, the thing is that the education law, it went through 2 readings in the Rada before it was approved by the Rada, and not only it can be a false impression that it was written by NGOs and totally approved by NGOs in all its parts. It was partly rewritten and amended by politicians, and I think that language issue, its roots in the politicians of Ukraine, because there is the coalition in the Ukrainian Rada. It is strongly pro-Ukrainian language, and it was expected that they would would amend this law in a more controversial way.
And I would like to bring the quotes from the Romanian Prime Minister, who even had cancelled his visit to Ukraine, as well the Minister for Foreign Affairs of Hungary. That's what they've said.
We urge the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights to start an investigation in connection with the law adopted in Ukraine and to use all means to stop violations of minority rights by this new law. When we learned of this law, I canceled my visit to Ukraine, and I also came out against the visit by the Speaker of the Ukrainian Parliament, scheduled for the end of September, in order to send a strong diplomatic signal. Canceling a presidential visit is an extremely powerful signal. I told him directly that this visit will not happen until progress is made on the education law.
And now, please watch the answer of the Ukrainian Minister of Foreign Affairs. We've asked this question.
First of all, the critics are speaking with regard to the interpretation, but not with regard to the law itself. I discussed with Lilia Grinevich all the details of this law thoroughly, and most importantly, its realization. What we propose is just the preservation of education in the languages of minorities. That's, first of all, an international duty, but it's something we need to do. But we also need to make sure that our citizens know Ukrainian to a decent standard so that they have the future in Ukraine, so that they could attend our universities and have jobs. I think I've said in an interview before that I visited the Hungarian consulate once, where I went downstairs and greeted everyone. Some people smiled at me and couldn't say anything back because they didn't know Ukrainian, hence why I spoke with all the ministers, had discussions. We want to add education in Ukrainian and not take away education in minority languages, and we are going to directly do that. Additionally, we are also going to talk with our Romanian and Hungarian partners. Now there are questions from the Bulgarians and others. Even the Hungarians have written a statement saying that now the Hungarian university in Ukraine will close. We're all laughing because nobody's going to close anything. Or there won't be any more education in schools. I say, how's that possible? You have the possibility to study biology in Hungarian, but you should know the terminology in Ukrainian to have a future in Ukraine. I think that our discussion will lead to understanding, but everybody has internal politics. Somebody tries to communicate, somebody tries to use internal politics. We will continue to work on it. The question is very important. Every citizen of Ukraine must know Ukrainian.
So this graph explains what we have, how many people it affects. We can say that 400,000 children from national minorities use their native language as medium of instruction today. Ukrainian language as the subject is taught for 2 hours per week in a lot of cases. What else we should probably mention?
Yes, that the 2 hours per week is a very small amount of time, and it is not enough for a profound knowledge of the language and ability to speak in it and to use it in society.
I'll ask to bring another graph, which also shows which communities its effect. We can speak about the people. These are we can have the bit more than 2,000 students studying in the Moldovan language, then later Polish. Of course, the largest community is 300,000 students studying in the Russian languages. Then, of course, Romanian and Hungarian is up to 16,000 people. But really, Igor, there is a question that it's really, instead of the multi-ethnic country, some kind of we are building the country with the one ethnic group of Ukrainians. So what would be your answer on that? And I also ask to bring the other chart.
Yes, I would not say that it will be a monolingual country that only Ukrainian will be used, because the issue in this law is to make Ukrainian language more taught and to provide for these children to know Ukrainian language better before they enter workforce or university, because currently, if children who study in their native language and they study Ukrainian just 2 hours per week, they cannot basically enter university, because university is in Ukrainian official language.
So what will happen? That's what we understand. And this is the graph which is provided by Ministry of Education and Science of Ukraine, that children from national minorities can obtain education in their native language in preschool. And as well, there is a possibility to study several subjects in native language. But still, it's kind of the choice of the state, not of the people.
Yes and no, because of course, everybody would like to be taught in their native language, and because it is easier, it is more convenient. But for the state, the issue is that these children, they are not able to enter the Ukrainian society fully integrated in it. So, as I see this reform, it is an attempt to provide for better integration of national minorities in Ukrainian society, but without assimilation, because they will study their language, they will study in their language before 10 years, so they will not forget their language or something like that. So I would not say that it is total assimilation.
Igor, thanks a lot. Igor Samokhin is the analyst for education policy at CEDOS think tank, but we promise to you that we will follow this topic, and we are about to invite the representative of the ministry, the representative who are opposing this law, and also talk to some of the communities. So we are with this topic, and thanks a lot for being with us. And I urge you to go to our webpage en.hromadske.ua, and there you can see the full version of our programs, of our shows, and the interviews, and you can also go to the social networks and search Hromadske International at Facebook and Twitter. That what we would like to give you, and I'll be back in a second. Mm-hmm. This week, Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko had met with Donald Trump in Washington. In a one-hour meeting, the two leaders discussed defense cooperation and deploying UN peacekeepers to Ukraine's east. Trump campaigned promising better ties with Russia, yet his foreign policy has more often supported by Ukraine. Here you can see the footage of that visit, which which had taken place on the side of the UN General Assembly. So how should the US respond to Russia elections hacking and its attempts to influence the US politics, and what Ukraine can expect also from current government, and how the US-Russia policy has developed? We had sat down with Michael McFaul, a scholar of Russia who served as the US ambassador under President Barack Obama, to get his perspective on the relations. How do you see the US-Russia relations under the Trump administration?
I think it's too early to tell. President Trump, of course, wants to have a more close relationship with Vladimir Putin. He said that many, many times as a candidate and now as president. Fortunately, in my view, that others around him have a different view. They're much more skeptical about Vladimir Putin. They think they need to push back on him. And so does the U.S. Congress, because the U.S. Congress passed a new legislation on sanctions. that make it very difficult to lift sanctions now. So the reality is that the rhetoric has been all about rapprochement and new relations with Russia, but the actual policy looks a lot more like the Obama policy towards Russia.
How do you think the U.S. should react on the Russia's meddling in the elections, and particularly all connected to the hacking of the emails? What should be the proper action?
Well, I supported what the President Obama did in terms of his kicking out Russians and new sanctions, but I would have gone farther. I think we should have gone farther with more sanctions. And now we need to wait until the investigations are done. And if the findings of those investigations show more evidence of meddling, and every week we learn something new, then there needs to be a tough response, because we cannot allow this to happen again in the future.
Do you think that RT and Sputnik and media like that should be registered at the foreign agents in the U.S.? And what are your take on that?
It's a very complicated question because we do have a very strong First Amendment right. But at the end of the day, I believe those organizations are instruments of Russian power to project the Kremlin power. And so I do think they should be registered. Now, it doesn't mean they should be closed down. I want to be very clear about that. People confuse that. I think they should be allowed to broadcast. I just want Americans to know who is the owner of that information that is being propagated. And most Americans don't know that right now.
You know, the Ukrainians were always concerned about Mr. Trump due to numbers of reasons a lot of people in the US are, in particular regarding Russia. Now they're trying to build some connection with Mr. Trump. To what extent it's necessary and it's possible to trust what you get from particularly, you know, his administration and him, if we know that there is some kind of a difference? How trustable?
That's a hard question, and I don't have an easy answer. I do know that for him, it's all about personal relationships. So meeting with him and having meetings with him, as your president has done and will do in the future, is the right thing to do. And secondly, I do trust his team. I know many of the people on his national security team, and I trust their instincts with respect to Russia. And so work with those relationships too, especially in the Pentagon and in the White House.
So, and finally, to what extent Ukraine is a question for the U.S. administration while they are dealing with Russia? And you know, now again there are talks about providing defense lethal weapon.
For the provision of lethal assistance, except for one person, and he happens to be the President of the United States. So where that debate ends, I do not know. With respect to Donbass, I guess I would just say I'm not optimistic that there's going to be an easy solution there. I'm skeptical about this new idea of peacekeepers that Mr. Putin has floated. And at the end of the day, Ukraine is a sovereign country, and the decision about whether there should be peacekeepers or not in your country fundamentally should be a decision for Ukrainians, not for the UN Security Council, not for Russia or the United States.
What the results of the German election mean for Ukraine, Russia and the region. And as well, we will take you into Zapad 2017 military exercise. That will be later, and I'll be back in a second. Scheduled for release next month, the Russian film Matilda tells the story of Tsar Nicholas II, premarital love affair with Polish ballerina Matilda Krzeszynskaya. On the surface, it seems like any other interesting film based upon a well-documented historical fact. But some Orthodox Christian believers feel the film is blasphemous because the last Tsar and his family were canonized by the Russian Orthodox Church. One of the leaders of the protests, the person who started this campaign, is Natalia Poklonskaya, who is currently the member of Russian Duma, and she is the former prosecutor of occupied, self-proclaimed Crimea, wherever you you name it. But she's no longer the only opponent of the film. Now some believers are even turning to acts of terrorism to express their discontent. My colleague Matthew Kupfer talked to Russian journalist Mikhail Fishman, and he explains why this is an unprecedented event in modern Russia.
Has there ever been anything like this in recent Russian history? And who are the ringleaders of this pushback against Matilda?
Oh, this is a very good question, and this is a very weird story from the very start. It started as some kind of, I'd say, grassroots activity of one of Russian lawmakers, Poklonskaya, and it was basically viewed as her sort of private obsession with mostly with the figure of Tsar himself at the beginning. So it was perceived as some kind of empty, tabloid-like subject, nothing really to talk about, much ado about nothing. And we didn't pay very much attention, at least I didn't. But it sort of started growing bigger and bigger since it's when it started triggering real terror attacks. Someone threw a Molotov cocktail into director's office. Then there was a truck who rammed into a movie theater in Yekaterinburg. Then there was a couple of cars were burned down in Moscow, if I'm correct. And then, as you already mentioned, the big movie chains actually refused to screen the film. And this is when it obviously moved to some other stage. It's like one of the most important political, social things going around here in Russia now. And latest developments as well are that these Orthodox believers, as you mentioned, these activists, which call themselves, if I'm correct, Christian State, which is for me a clear reference to Islamic State, of course. They are somehow believed to be connected. Some of them were even detained, charged with these attacks, with burning the cars at least. Then their leader, somehow, either he is still under detention or he disappeared already. No one knows really what's going on with them right now. That's what we want to. That's what we're trying to figure out basically right now, where they are. So this is the state of affairs for this very moment.
So you mentioned Natalia Poklonskaya, a very well-known figure in Ukraine, the Duma deputy from annexed Crimea, but she seems to have some support among high-level people, including Bishop Tikhon Shevkunov, who is believed to be Russian President Vladimir Putin's personal confessor and an important church official in Russia. How much backing do you think she has?
Well, this is the most interesting question. And we know, for example, that, well, at least we assume that Vladimir Putin doesn't really pay very much, at least he didn't pay very much attention and didn't really care about the whole thing. He was giving his comments a few weeks ago. No, earlier than that, whatever. Before it grew, the whole thing, and his position was that, well, we're a free country and we favor any kind of discussion, so so be it. But yes, it's clear that there are some alt-conservative circles in church who share Poklonskaya's views on this subject and on the figure of the Tsar. But they're not alone, these church officials. We also know that Russian Parliament Speaker Vyacheslav Volodin also supported Poklonskaya already after it was these movie chains announced that they were not going to run the film. So there are definitely some fractions inside the system, inside the machine of Russian power, who, if they didn't start the whole thing, which we don't know, they obviously embraced it at some point. when the whole thing started growing, and the turning point was this movie theater chain refusing to show the film. Then the culture ministry stood up and actually said that it's a shame, that it's going all the wrong way, that something has to be done. So the position of Russian state in the face of Minister of Culture, Medinsky, was quite outspoken and was quite clear. If they will still not show it, this movie theater chain, this will be a very important thing which could trigger some other complications for art industry, of course, and for the whole atmosphere, climate of censorship and pressure. This is for sure.
So today, Germany has elected the Bundestag. Angela Merkel, whom you can see, will remain the Chancellor for another 4 years. Yet the ruling coalition might change. That was already said by her opponent, Martin Schulz. Merkel is likely the strongest opponent of Russian President Vladimir Putin, and Germany plays a crucial role in Russian-Ukrainian negotiation within the Normandy format. We already mentioned that her party was the opposition party, and I'd like also to show a bit of the video of Martin Schulz. It's not just about him; it's about the part of his party. For instance, Gerhard Schröder, the former head of the Social Democrat, is currently working for Gazprom, and now you can see also the Martin Schulz together with Pat Cox and Alexander Kwasniewski. Why this is also significant is that during his time at the European Parliament, he also sent this mission to support the Ukrainian Prime Minister Tymoshenko at the time in jail. So he has his special attitude towards Ukraine. So I would like to bring you the quotes from the German expert and the German politician who explain what can expect Ukraine and Russia from from current Chancellor and from Angela Merkel after we would know what would be the coalition.
The politics will stay stable. We have the Normandy format, which means France and Germany are working together. There is the wish and the decision to stick to Minsk, although everybody knows that Minsk is not really very successful. There is the decision that sanctions should stay in place as long as Minsk is not fulfilled, but I would have to lie if I would not admit that the people who are pushing to lift the sanctions, the voices are getting stronger, and so I think what we really need to be aware of that giving Putin for this aggressiveness, giving in, would be harming all of us in the European countries. I hope that the next German parliament will understand that.
As far as Angela Merkel is concerned, the line will be continued. That means lifting the sanctions only if Russia fulfills its obligations from the Minsk Accord, but there are mounting pressure in all areas of political areas in Germany that is pressing towards no, we should look for a better relationship with Russia as soon as possible. We need normalization. We should not wait until Russia fulfills its obligations at the whole, but we should make a step-by-step, introduce a step-by-step mechanism saying if they agree to have a ceasefire, then we should loosen the sanctions.
So the elections in big European countries definitely had their impact to the Eastern Europe, and Brexit was widely regarded as the blow against EU unity and bad omen for Ukraine. So we have sat down with Alan Duncan, the United Kingdom Minister for Europe and Americas. He says that his country will continue support Ukraine even once it leaves the EU. Watch our interview.
How would you define the UK role in Russian-Ukrainian conflict negotiations?
Well, I think that, first of all, Britain has a very clear view about this, but we're also participating fully in the international efforts which are being made to address this problem. The annexation of eastern Ukraine is totally unacceptable. And we are one of those leading countries which says that a rules-based international order is essential for the peace and security of the world. So we believe very strongly that what Russia has done and is doing is wrong. So we fully support the opinions and view of Ukraine, and will continue to play our part in the United Nations and elsewhere in addressing this issue very firmly, very strongly and consistently.
There is a very important event in Great Britain, is Brexit. What are the prospects of Ukraine-UK relations in all fields after this event?
Well, I'm delighted you've asked this question, because it gives me the opportunity to say something we feel very strongly about. Yeah, we will leave the European Union, but we're not going to leave Ukraine. We are still part of Europe. We're part of the United Nations, P5, G20, NATO, and we will play our full part after we've left the European Union in the defense and security of the wider world, including and perhaps particularly this part of the world. So we might be leaving the European Union, but we will not be leaving our responsibilities as a major world player to make sure that important issues such as the future of Ukraine are addressed, and that the process that exists will have Britain strongly in it.
Another story of the week. Officially, it was just under 13,000 troops conducting defense military exercise against made-up countries with funny names. But Western estimates place the real number of troops in Russia in Belarus. Zapad 2017 War Games, which concluded earlier this week, at up to 100,000. And for Belarus, Eastern European neighbors, it looked like the start of a possible attack. In order to diffuse tension, Belarus ultimately invited military monitors and foreign journalists to observe Zapad 2017. Yet their access to the exercises was limited. But Hromadske got accreditation for the military exercises and brought you back this report.
На разведку целей удара в районе полигона выполнял самолет Су-24МР Воздушно-космических сил Российской Федерации.
On paper, the Russian-Belarusian Zapad 2017 military exercises resemble a children's war game. 3 made-up states attacking another country. But the soldiers and the equipment are real, and all of this is happening a few hundred kilometers away from Ukraine, where Russia launched a very real and ongoing war 3 years ago. The scenario behind the Zapad 2017 exercises is that 12,700 Belarusian and Russian soldiers are coming face-to-face with 3 fictional separatist states: Vyshnoria, located in the Grodno region of Belarus, and Vesbaria and Lubenia, located on the territories of Poland, Latvia, and Lithuania. In Belarus, Vyshnoria has proven to be comedy gold. Some Belarusians are even describing it as a better, more democratic version of their own country and buying mock-up Vyshnorian passports. However, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland do not see anything funny in Zapad 2017. Their governments are seriously concerned with why Belarus's Ministry of Defense chose to see their territories as enemies. But the Ministry of Defense says there is no reason to worry.
Nobody should have concern. We don't have any territorial claims against anyone, but we also will not tolerate such claims toward our country.
This is the start of Zapad 2017's active phase. Buses and military trucks ferry journalists to the airfield. From there, they should be able to see the so-called Union State military, in other words, the Russian and Belarusian armies, bomb a runway that has been captured by imaginary terrorists. According to the scenario, the terrorists possess an anti-aircraft missile complex and have just struck a plane.
Самолет, проводивший разведку целей, уничтожен. ПЗРК противника. Сейчас перед вами будет отрабатываться эпизод проведения поисково-спасательных работ.
But all that the dozens of European journalists and military observers can see are two pilots ejecting from the battered airplane. It's raining, so the view is partly blocked by the clouds. What's more, talking to the participating troops, whether Russian or Belarusian, is not allowed. The general issuing commands on the airfield occasionally comes out to do a press briefing where he reads directly from a piece of paper.
An Su-24 aircraft of the Russian Federation will execute a photography session of the results of the airstrike.
The Belarusian Minister of Defense is trying to show off his transparency. He says that everyone was allowed to come and watch. But how much can monitors actually see? The official number of participants in Zapad 2017 is 12,700. That's suspiciously just below 13,000, the maximum number of troops allowed to participate before international agreements require foreign observers. Western officials, however, do not trust these numbers. They estimate that the actual number of troops is around 100,000, which would make Zapad 2017 the largest war games since the end of the Cold War. Despite all the concerns, it appears that Zapad 2017 has now come to a peaceful end, but there is still over a week before September 30th, the day that Russian troops are scheduled to completely depart Belarusian territory. By that time, the international observers will leave and the media interest around the globe will likely fade too. These war games may have proven to be as innocuous as Russia claims, but according to Belarusian military expert Alexander Alesin, there is a real war going on, an information war, and Belarus lost.
This is most likely Russia's attacking the information war in order to test the waters. How the Belarusian government and society will react, and how the governments of our neighboring countries will react. And in my opinion, they achieved their goal. They got their reaction and will now be able to predict in the future.
Alesin says that Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko was strongly against Zapad 2017, but due to his country's economic dependence on Russia, he could not object.
The man who jailed 100 corrupt officials. This is about the Spanish prosecutor Carlos Castresana. He went to work as the United Nations appointed commissioner against impunity in Guatemala 10 years ago. In the course of his anti-corruption work in South American country, he really put 150 corrupt officials in jail. Hromadske sat down with him during his visit to Kiev earlier this month to find out how uproot entrenched corruption in Ukraine. And according to Castresana, it may not be as difficult as it looks.
Mr. Castresana, so how would you evaluate Ukraine's anti-corruption efforts so far, and what needs to be done to make real progress against corruption?
I am learning, so I am beginning to understand the effort that is being made since Maidan until today. I think it is work in progress. I can see, but it is a very incipient evaluation, some positive steps, some resistances, and this is the logic and the contradiction that you always find in these transitional processes. I think that some things have to be improved, some other things are working in the proper way, but I have expectations that the final results of this process will be successful.
Okay, well, let's talk a bit about this anti-corruption court, the idea that it should be created. Ukraine's prosecutor general has opposed the creation of an anti-corruption court. Instead, he proposes these anti-corruption panels in the existing prosecutorial system, in the legal structures that exist. Does Ukraine really need an anti-corruption court? What's your opinion on that? And how critical is it? And do you see progress on it?
I have not a clear idea at this time if you need a new court or you can use the structure of the judiciary you already have. But clearly, in one way or the other way, the important thing, the essential thing is having independent and reliable judges. So the problem is not probably formal this way or this other way, but the problem is substantial. Do you have reliable independent judges that can be granted the freedom to decide the cases of corruption as people is expecting, providing a deterrent effect because they will serve justice and show that justice is served? That this is what Ukraine, in a sense, is needing. So I was telling before, today itself, what Ukraine needs, in my view, is a demonstration effect. It's a turning point that established clearly that was permitted with impunity before will be not permitted anymore. So a few important cases where convictions are achieved and shown that the situation has changed. And this message being spread in all the society. This is what is really necessary. The way of getting this with this court or with a new court, it's actually, I think, secondary. The question is having reliable judges.
I think a lot of the public would agree with you that a demonstration is needed. A couple months ago, I think it was actually last month, the National Anti-Corruption Bureau published a report that showed what it's achieved, what it's done. And so far, there have been 15 cases that ended with criminal sentences. But most of these were fairly minor corruption figures. Mm-hmm. And the public knows that corruption is a very, very persistent problem in Ukraine. So what needs to happen for there actually to be guilty verdicts, for there to be a significant demonstration of the effect of anti-corruption work?
Let me offer you, I don't know, I cannot tell you in Ukraine, but let me offer you the experience in Guatemala. For this demonstration effect, we had to bring to trial 7 high-impact cases, very important cases, not minor criminality, but high-ranking officers in the military, in the police, in politicians, businessmen, so people that usually are beyond the legality, and bring them to trial and get convictions in 7 cases. Mm-hmm. And then things began to change.
The struggle to establish an anti-corruption court, or for that matter, nominating auditors for the National Anti-Corruption Bureau, has been very difficult. It hasn't seen so much success recently. Do you think that this indicates that the authorities are afraid of the anti-corruption structures that they've created? And what or who do you think is the biggest obstacle to fighting corruption in Ukraine?
I'm not that familiar with the situation in Ukraine to give you a proper response, but in general terms, I would say this kind of changes always bring resistances. Mm-hmm. So when you bring a change in the sense of bringing more transparency and more social activity, participation of citizenship, there will be always resistances. So any change of this kind you bring will have people getting benefits and will have people suffering damage. These people suffering damage will oppose. And it is part of the logic of the functioning of any democratic society. The question is building partnership, coalitions that are for the changes that the society needs, and the changes will sooner or later come. That will be a political resistance, will be, always is. Mm-hmm.
So we are talking also about the processes which are taking place in neighboring countries in Eastern Europe. So Poland and Hungary are ruled by the governments with a fraught relationship towards democratic values. What does this and other strains on the EU means for the bloc's future? We are talking to Wojciech Przybylski, who is the editor-in-chief of Visegrad Insight and also the chairman of the Republika Nowa, a Polish intellectual who gives as the forecast for probably for this political season?
Within the European Union, we know that there is a new trend coming up. It's about the reform of the European Union, with the election of the French President Emmanuel Macron earlier this year, and most probably a re-election of Angela Merkel in Germany in September for the position of Chancellor. We will see a new impulse for reforming the continent, not only around European Union, but also, or predominantly, around Eurozone. Countries of Eurozone will matter much more in decision-making in the European Union. And it's not only about the money, it's also about the other spheres of influence of the members that belong to this group. And here, the important countries that belong already to Eurozone are Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Slovakia, but unfortunately not Poland or Hungary, which at the same time started to, you could say, rebel against the mainstream of the on the continent, in Europe, and they are having a lot of political fights with the other partners in the European Union.
Emmanuel Macron visited Eastern Europe late August, and he criticized Poland and Hungary, and he also mentioned that Poland is isolated. He got a reply from Beata Szydło, who responded that French president lacks experience and he'd better occupy with his own affairs. Do you think that this isolation of Poland and Hungary is something we could really talk about now?
That is not completely true. Emmanuel Macron definitely made an overstatement and he evoked, I think deliberately, a diplomatic crisis with Poland. He indeed criticized Poland in the most open way so far. We didn't see that before, on the issues that are important to the whole community, European Union. He basically backed the position of the European Commission from Brussels, and also Angela Merkel followed in his opinion that Poland is not cooperative and not willing to apply the standards of the European Union at the moment. It's partly about the whole Poland, the whole country, but it's mostly about the government. The government of Poland is being criticized by other partners in the European Union on various issues, and that comes vice versa. Poland and Hungary also criticize the other governments, which is within natural limits of a political debate in Europe, but it brings a lot of tension and uncertainty. There is a growing fear that eventually this will lead to a smaller part of involvement of Poland or Hungary in the main decision-making bodies within Europe.
You spoke about government. What is, according to you, public opinion, public reaction to these critics, which come frequently from Brussels, from Paris, or from Berlin? Can you say that the kind of anti-European attitudes in Poland now, among young people?
Surprisingly, no. More than 80% of Polish population are very happy about membership in the European Union, and people want to stay members of the European Union. So the government in Poland doesn't have an easy task if it wanted to move away from the core of Europe, because the population really supports the project.
So Hromadske is the multimedia platform. So for the full version of our programs, go to our webpage en.hromadske, and also follow us on Twitter, Hromadske, search Hromadske International at Facebook, and we'll be for you there all the time. So thank you from the entire team of Hromadske International. We are explaining you Ukraine and Eastern Europe. Thank you and goodbye.